recording is on. Very good. So recall from yesterday, or let's kind of re-up from yesterday. Okay. When we do aerobic training, the purpose of doing aerobic training, in addition to just accumulating some physical activity, we're going to run, we're going to bike, we're going to elliptical, something like that. The purpose and the goal generally needs to be to improve cardiorespiratory fitness or cardiorespiratory endurance. So we want to make your VO2 max go up, okay? And in effort to try to figure out what the optimum kind of duration and intensity, number of days per week that we're gonna do with that, I'm gonna walk you guys through some of the research that has been done to kind of let you know, what do we know? Which of these things is the most important? How much of one do you need versus how much of the other? Okay, so now what I'm going to show you guys, what we're going to talk about on this, is purely in relation to, okay, what's going to make your VO2 max go up. Okay, so this is going to improve your fitness level, and improving that fitness level is likely going to have some impact on your ability to do endurance exercise. So to run a faster 5K or 10K or half marathon or a marathon or some kind of an event like that. Okay. But that's not the only thing. If you just kind of look at what this does, sometimes just improving VO2 max is not necessarily the only thing that we need to work on in order to be better at like doing a race. So just keep in mind, this is just about VO2 max. Okay. So I'm going to tell you all in many ways, much like resistance training, that the intensity at which you perform your aerobic training is the single most important thing. So like with resistance training, the amount of weight that you're lifting, more weight's the easiest way to overload the system. With aerobic training, intensity, which is going to equate to the speed at which you're running, right? Or whether you're running or walking up a hill, okay? Or the power output on your spin bike, or the speed at which you're riding your bike if you're out like on the street doing those things. Intensity is the most important thing, okay? If you want to make your VO2 max go up, you need to exercise at an intensity in an untrained person that's probably greater than about 50% of your VO2 max. If you're pretty well trained, it may need to be greater than 60 or 70 or 80% of your VO2 max in order to drive further adaptations, okay? The reason that this is that upping the intensity, upping the work rate is the easiest way to require your muscles to generate more force. Therefore, they're going to need more energy, so that drives the mitochondria to work harder, which drives the cardiovascular system to work harder, and it drives the pulmonary system to have to work harder to bring more things in, okay? So intensity is the most important thing, right? Again, it's probably also the thing, like with resistance training, that people do the worst job of. Running at a sufficient intensity to drive increases in VO2 max is not fun. I mean, maybe, I don't know, we won't ask Maddie if she enjoyed running when she was doing track and some of those things, but I know running is good for me, and it still sucks. In my mind, if you're doing it correctly, it's never fun, because the intensity is always enough that it is somewhat unpleasant, okay? Okay, so secondary to intensity, we do have some ideas about what is the ideal length of time, or the required length of time, and the required frequency or number of days per week that we need to do things, okay? And so duration and frequency are have some upper limits to them, and depending upon your state of training, there's going to be some lower bounds as well. All right, so the idea that increasing duration, increasing how long you run or walk or bike, is going to drive an increase in VO2 max as long as you are going longer than what you typically do. If you're used to going for 10 minutes, try to go for 12 or 15. If you're used to going for 30 minutes, try to go a little bit longer, okay? So there's no real kind of bottom level for people that are reasonably trained, probably for most of you guys. You know, even starting at like 8 to 10 minutes, if it was at a sufficient intensity, would probably be okay as a place to start with to get a little bit of improvement, okay? The more trained you are, probably the longer you need to go, depending upon what the intensity is. However, and this is an interesting fact, anything that lasts longer than about 40 minutes, okay, you're going to get an increase in VO2 max if you increase your training duration up to about 40 minutes, and then it levels off, okay? So in that way, going for an hour is not necessarily better than going 40 minutes from a purely increasing VO2 max standpoint, okay? Similarly with frequency, if you don't ever go run, 1 day a week is better than none. You're going to get a little bit of an increase, okay? 2 days is probably better than one. For most people, you know, 3 or 4 days a week is perfectly good, right? Similar to duration, though, if you do more than 5 days in a week, you're not going to get any extra benefit. Like running every day in a week is really not any better for improving your VO2 max than going 5 days. Okay, so a 6th or a 7th day in a week. And this illustrates, we think, the necessity of rest. We need to rest. Okay, the body needs some time to rest and recover and recuperate from all of this stress that you're placing on it. Okay. Now, what this raises is some interesting questions, though. My dad's a marathon runner. Back when he can't run marathons anymore because he has a bad back, but when he was doing, he would run 6 or 7 days a week. And he would run most days at least an hour, sometimes longer than all of that. And so he would get very fussy when I would tell him when I was a grad student, Dad, you're wasting your time. You don't need to go this extra kind of distance. You're just putting more stress on your body. Maybe think about dialing it back and going at a higher intensity or something. And this tends to be a thing where we see, especially on the high school level for endurance like track and cross country, for endurance performance. We see athletes that probably train for too long, too many days per week, and they miss out on doing things with intensity in that way. Okay, so that's another. We also have a class on advanced endurance exercise training prescription that I would encourage you guys to take if you have some interest in those things. But there we go. Okay, so for an average person, okay, for an average person, remember, okay, that the ACSM guidelines for health benefits were 150 minutes per week, okay, of moderate, 75 minutes per week of vigorous, right, plus 2 days of strength training. Those were the guidelines to get some health benefits, okay? For fitness benefits, to improve your VO2 max, okay, we need a sufficient, what we would call aerobic training volume. So a sufficient combination of frequency, duration, and intensity that's probably going to fall into 3 to 5 days per week, 20 to 60 minutes per session, okay, at an intensity of, there's a word here that's called VO2 reserve. So 40 to 85% of VO2 reserve, or heart rate reserve, all right? What this means, don't worry about VO2 reserve right now. Don't worry about what that word is. Just imagine that what we're going to say is you need to be at something that is approximately, if you're very, very unfit, 40 or 50% of your maximal cardiorespiratory fitness capacity, okay? At a metabolic rate equal to that, up to maybe, if you're more fit, maybe somewhere in the 85 to 90% of VO2 max. For most people, the best way for us to know what your intensity during a bout of exercise is to look at your heart rate and figure out, are you exercising at a percentage of something called heart rate reserve that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides, okay? So we can, if we know that we need you to be at 60% of your VO2 max during your 30-minute session, we can figure out what is the heart rate that is most likely going to denote that you are at an intensity of about 60% of VO2 max. And we're going to do that by calculating what we call a target heart rate, and we're going to use the heart rate reserve method to do that. And I'll kind of explain how we do that in the next coming slides. Okay, so depending upon what your goals are, if you have health goals, right, it can be kind of longer, slower kinds of things that we're doing. If you want to improve VO2 max, there's this kind of moderate stuff. And then people that are really, really interested in endurance performance or athletic performance, oftentimes they will recommend, right, they're going to recommend some kind of higher intensity, potentially longer duration training. That's what this slide is trying to show. Okay. Okay. In order to figure out what your heart rate during exercise needs to be, so that we can figure out if, when you do your bout of exercise, if you are reaching a sufficiently high intensity, okay, we need to understand how we calculate something called heart rate reserve. And the first piece of that we need to do is we need to calculate your age predicted max heart rate, okay? Your age predicted max heart rate. So I'll ask Kiana, I can see you. Kiana, do you mind telling us how old you are?
21.
21, okay? So to calculate age predicted max heart rate, you take 220 and you subtract the age. So we would estimate that Kiana has an age predicted max heart rate of 199 beats per minute, okay? We operate under the assumption that if Kiana was running at an intensity that would equate to her maximal aerobic capacity, to her VO2 max, that her heart rate would be about 199 beats per minute. She will have maxed out her heart rate, maxed out her cardiac output at that intensity that would be her VO2 max. Okay? So I want you all to know that we can predict max heart rate in that way, but there's some wiggle to that, okay? Kiana's max heart rate may not be 199. It might be 190, it might be 210, okay? Give or take 5 or 10 beats per minute on either side, okay? We've done max test on folks that were 20 or 21 years old, and we've seen heart rates at max that are going to reach up into, you know, like 211, 212, things like that, okay? I've also seen people that we are certain that they're at their max and they're only at like 188, okay, when it ought to be 200. So there's a little bit of wiggle, but we're going to operate, okay, that in most people, 220 minus your age is going to be it's going to be about where we need to be, okay? There are some other equations that you may run into in other classes or various things. There's these newer ones, which the equation is 207 minus 70% of your age. You get, the numbers are different by like 2 beats per minute, okay? Or 211 minus 64% of your age. We end up in about the same place, okay? Scientists are never happier, and I kind of have to give ourselves grief. We're never happier than we're taking something that's perfectly good and trying to make it like infinitesimally better in that way, and that's where these equations come from. So we're going to start off by calculating our max heart rate, 220 minus age, okay? So to do that then, what do we do next? To figure out what if we wanted, say, Kiana to be at 60% of or 70% of her VO2 max. So the idea of using heart rate reserve, we need to talk about this really quickly before I get into the actual calculations. So have any of you ever like gotten on a treadmill, maybe over at the Huff or something, gotten on a treadmill or an elliptical or a bike, and it has the little thing in front of you and it gives you like these heart rate zones, and it says like there's a cardio zone and there's a fat burning zone, and it will kind of give you these heart rate ranges that are going to be there? Anybody ever had that experience? Okay, just me. All right. Well, we need to get you guys onto some different cardio machines then. Well, I had a point to that, and I've completely like lost all train of thought for a moment. Give me a second. I got to think about where I was going. No, it's not coming back. Okay. So a traditional way of trying to estimate your intensity during exercise is just to calculate, okay, what is your heart rate during exercise as a percentage of your age predicted max. Okay, so let's take a person and let's, for the ease of math's sake, assume that their max heart rate is 200. And so we say we want them to be at a heart rate that is 70% of their age predicted max. That would be 0.7 multiplied by 200. So their 70% of age predicted max heart rate would be 140 beats per minute. Okay, so back before you guys were born, that was the way that, because heart rate is going to have a linear relationship with VO2, with oxygen consumption during exercise, and max heart rate tends to occur at max VO2, people just said, okay, well, if I need to be at 60% of VO2 max or 70% of VO2 max, let's just go and put ourselves at that corresponding percentage of maximum heart rate. And that's not an unreasonable thing to do, okay? But what we have since learned is that there is a way to use heart rate and to calculate where you need to be that is slightly more accurate, or not even slightly, it's quite a bit more accurate as putting you at a percentage of your VO2 max. Okay, so this is called the heart rate reserve method, or the Carvonen method. Okay, so in this slide, THR stands for target heart rate. So this is the heart rate we need you to be at during your bout of exercise. Okay, and so if we want to prescribe exercise at 70% of VO2 max, so that's going to get us at a sufficient intensity to drive adaptations, we also then need to be at 70% of something called heart rate reserve. Heart rate reserve is the distance, okay, or the number of heartbeats that you have available to you. It's the difference between your age predicted max heart rate and your resting heart rate. Okay, so you have some resting heart rate. In our example here, we'll call it 60 beats per minute. So I'm at 60. My max heart rate is 200. And so you have this, what we would call a quote unquote reserve. You have, okay, 140 beats of reserve heart rate, this ability to increase up another 140 beats before you get to your age predicted max. And so what research has shown us is that if we calculate your heart rate reserve, that the percentage of the heart rate reserve that you're going to use during a bout of aerobic exercise, that percentage much more closely matches the percentage of VO2 max at which you would be exercising during that bout. Okay, so if I want to be at 70% of VO2 max, I have a person that has a resting heart rate of 60. They have a max heart rate of 200. Okay, so I need to calculate their heart rate reserve, which is going to be 200 minus 60. So they have a heart rate reserve of 140 beats per minute. Okay, I then take 70% of that 140 beats per minute, right? That 70%, I'm going to do some math here on my calculator really quickly, right? 140 times 0.7, that's 98 beats. So I need to use 98 of those 140 reserve beats per minute in order to get myself to that. Okay. So what we have to do then is, if while you're just sitting there, your heart rate is 60, and you need to use 98 beats of that reserve, and you've got to add your percentage of heart rate reserve that we need to use back into the resting heart rate. So you take 60, your resting rate, we add that with our 98 beats per minute that are going to get us at 70% of heart rate reserve, and we get a number so that when you go out to run today, your heart rate should be 158 beats per minute. Okay. You will note that that 158 is almost 20 beats per minute higher than if you just simply took 70% of your age predicted max heart rate. So what we have found is that when you use the percentage of age predicted max heart rate, that tends to underestimate. Okay, you get a heart rate that's going to be too low for whatever percentage of VO2 max that you want to exercise at. So it needs to be a little bit higher. That's why heart rate reserve is better. Okay. So as part of what I'm going to have you guys do for your aerobic exercise critique is I'm going to ask you in there to calculate your own heart rate reserve. Okay. And based upon what it says in the program or what you think the program should have said, I'm going to ask you to calculate what your target heart rate would need to be during that to do the program that you're evaluating. Okay. Questions. This is usually something that we have a little bit of trouble with. Generally, I ask a question on the test and I give people like an age and a resting heart rate and a percentage thing, and ask people to calculate a target heart rate. In about half the class, they know it's coming and they still can't get it. So with what I've just said, do you guys have questions about that?
Can you explain heart rate reserve again? Like,
of course, Lindsay. So reserve is, you can define it as, it's the difference between your resting heart rate and your age predicted max heart rate. Okay. Think of it as, how much gas do you have in your gas tank? Like your car is sitting there at rest, your car's just idling, right? And you have some extra, you've got this extra amount of gas in the tank that will let you go a certain distance. And then based upon how fast you want to go, you're going to use more or less of that extra kind of gas that's in the tank. That's how I try to conceptualize it. But there's this range where your resting rate is something, your max rate is something else. And so there's this range or this band of heart rate kind of that you have the capacity to increase to, right? And so Lindsay, if you and I have the same resting heart rate, I'm going to have a smaller heart rate reserve than you because I'm older, okay? I'm probably going to have about 20 less beats per minute in my heart rate reserve than you are because I'm older than you, probably roughly 20 years older, okay? Give or take a year or two, all right? And so I don't love that they use the word reserve, but nobody asked me what we should call it. But that's what it's trying to denote, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And so the thing that people seem to have the most trouble with is that you calculate what your reserve is, and you multiply that, you get by the percentage of VO2 max where you want to be at, right? So, and then you have to add that number back into rest. That's how we arrive at the actual heart rate that we need to be at during exercise. So you're going to go run, you got your Apple Watch on, today I want to be at 60% of VO2 max, so I need to be, I need to be here. That's how we would arrive at figuring out, oh, I need to be at 165 beats per minute or 160 beats per minute or something like that. Okay. Other questions right now? Okay. Well, there will be one on the aerobic critique. I promise you there will be one that we do on the test. Okay. So maybe when we take a break here in a couple of minutes, I can throw one together and you guys can work on it yourself to try to figure out what the number would need to be, and you can all like hold up a sheet of paper with it on there or something. We can see how we're doing. All right. Okay. So that's how we determine those things. So when we're going to evaluate a program or you're going to decide what you need to do with aerobic exercise, we will apply the fit principle just like we did with what we did with resistance training. We need to know a frequency, and remember that our frequency probably needs to be somewhere between 3 and 5 times per week. If you're going to be a kind of high level athlete, maybe it needs to be 6 or 7 depending. Okay. The intensity needs to be generally somewhere between 40 and 50% of VO2 max up to maybe 85 or 90%. The more fit you are, the higher the intensity likely needs to be to continue to drive adaptations. Our duration, probably, if you're not very fit, duration of maybe 15 to 30 minutes per session. If you're more fit, then 20 to 50 or 60 is fine. And then your mode is just, do I want to bike? Do I want to run? Do I want to elliptical? Do I want to row? Okay. I need to mention something about the type here that's interesting to me and very frustrating to my father, but probably doesn't matter to most of you. So if you're not very fit, okay, if you're completely sedentary and you start training by riding, let's say, an exercise bike, you take a spin class, okay, your VO2 max is going to go up. So by becoming more fit by training on the bike, your VO2 max during cycling is certainly going to go up. But if you were very unfit to begin with, your VO2 max is also going to go up if we tested you on the treadmill, okay? So, but as you become more and more fit, there's going to be less and less transfer in the training adaptations from one type of exercise to a different type of exercise, okay? Once your VO2 max gets into the, I don't know, maybe into the high 50s, into the 60s and the 70s, and you get really fit, if you train by running, your running VO2 max will go up. Your cycling VO2 max is likely not to go up to a similar extent, okay? The adaptations become a little bit more specific to the type of exercise that you do during training. This raises some questions. You guys are going to look at your aerobic training programs, and you're going to see a lot of them that advocate for this idea of what has traditionally been called cross training. Okay? Go run today, and then maybe go for a walk tomorrow, and then the day after that, go ride your bike or do something. That's fine, right? It may keep you from getting bored, and as long as you're not very fit and you hit a sufficient intensity for each type of modality, you're going to get an increase in VO2 max, not just in that modality, but that will transfer. But once you become pretty, but like the time you finish the semester of doing your spin class, if you want to get better at running, then you're going to need to go run. You're going to kind of lose the ability for spin class to make you a better runner, okay? And as you get closer, you're kind of maxing out the cardiorespiratory changes and adaptations and the mitochondrial adaptations. And so those last bits of things that might let your VO2 max go up a little bit more are going to be, are you changing your running form or your cycling form? It's more about these kind of neuromuscular patterns that let things happen. So this used to always drive my dad nuts, because on the days that he didn't run when he was training for marathons, he would go ride his bike. And he would think that that was good for him. And I would just tell him, Dad, all you're doing is getting better at riding your bike. You're too fit that riding your bike is not making you a better runner. And he had a hard time wrapping his head around that, which makes complete sense. But just keep that in mind, because you're going to see in your aerobic program, a lot of you, it's going to talk about doing cross training, okay? And just remember that to a point, there's going to be some transfer, but to some other points, if your goal is to be a better runner, you just need to go run. If your goal is to be a better cyclist, you just need to go cycle, okay? Okay. So we can also apply the PROS principles, right? When we do aerobic training. Again, the key thing is overload, and to progressively overload, such that as you overload and you get adaptations and what you were doing previously becomes easier, then you need to make it more difficult again, okay? So the easiest way to overload is to increase intensity. Secondary ways to increase overload is to go a little bit longer at any given frequency of like any number of days per week. So instead of doing 3 days for 10 minutes, do 3 days at 15 minutes. Or you can go a 4th day a week rather than going 3 days per week, or a 5th day a week, okay? So we can try to find some ways to balance all of those. Most people that suggest how you should alter your training and progress it over time is that you don't ever, in a given week, you don't ever want to increase more than one of these things. So I'm going to go from 3 days per week for 30 minutes at 60% of heart rate reserve, okay, to 4 days per week for 30 minutes at 60% of heart rate reserve. But you would not want to go to, 4 days per week at 45 minutes at 70%. You would not want to change all of those. You would just change change one this week, and then next week change a different one, and the week after change a different one in that particular way, okay? Okay, so application of those is, I think, pretty straightforward. All right, so there we go with that. So here's what I'm going to do. We will take a break until I'm going to stop sharing, going to recording again. So we're going to shift now away from cardiorespiratory fitness and kind of how that impacts mortality, and how we might train to improve our cardiorespiratory fitness to therefore decrease our mortality rates. And we're going to get started with, I don't know that I want to call this, call obesity the scourge of American society. That's probably maybe a bit of an overestimate. But if obesity in combination with being sedentary is the second leading preventable cause of death in the U.S., then it is certainly something that we need to understand and be able to try to work on in some ways. Okay, so we need to make a distinction, right? And I think this is a very important distinction for everyone. And we've got to be, I don't know what really the right way to describe all of this. We need to be cognizant of and kind about talking about body composition, talking about differences in body composition, talking about obesity and those kinds of things, because we have to be cognizant of body image issues and kind of way that people feel about all this and those things. Okay, so when we talk about body composition, right, initially we're not actually talking about obesity. All we're talking about with body composition is, what are you made up of? Okay, what is the quantification of the chemical and anatomical makeup of your body? How much water do you have? How much protein or muscle do you have? How much fat, and where is that fat? Where is that muscle in your body? Okay, body composition is in some ways related, Okay, it's related to obesity. If we want to say that obesity is really having an excess amount of body lipid or body fat, okay, then purely body composition is it's a measure of nutritional status. Okay, so if I take any of you and I put you on Survivor, or I put you on, I don't know, pick your other, like, out in the wilderness show. I put you on Naked and Afraid, if you've ever watched that, which again seems like a ridiculous idea for a show, but there you are. Body composition indicates energy balance. It indicates nutritional status. Okay, so what you are made up of right now at this exact moment is a reflection of how much food and what is the composition of that food in relation to what your outgoing energy expenditure has been over, I don't know, the last few weeks. Okay, and so when you don't eat enough, when you eat less, take in less food than what you're burning in a particular day, then your body composition will change, and it can change relatively quickly. Okay, when you eat more than you burn in a particular day, your body composition can also change. Sometimes eating more, it's going to take longer for it to change in the kind of more direction. It may take longer to develop additional subcutaneous fat or additional muscle, and things than it does. You can lose weight very, very quickly, especially if you just want to lose some water weight over the weekend. We can do that. Okay. While there's not a huge amount of data, not nearly as much data as there is when we use the body mass index, we do know that your body composition um, is related to your overall health status and your overall well-being. Okay, there's evidence that some kinds of particular things with body composition are going to be related to cardiovascular disease. They're going to be related to diabetes. They're also related on the bottom end of things to eating disorders, to low bone mineral density, so osteoporosis. So there's some, and they're also related in a lot of people, regardless of body composition, to anxiety, to depression, to eating disorders and things. And so there's some evidence that this is an overall well-being issue that we need to be aware of. Okay, so to understand body composition, we first need to understand, kind of what it's not. Okay, so we showed you data on the first or the second day of class about the body mass index. And I think I told you on that day that the body mass index is not in any way, shape, or form a measure of what it is that you're made up of. It really is a measure of body size, or really it's kind of a volume issue or an area issue, that it's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. Okay, BMI makes no distinction between what it thinks of as being overweight and over, what we would say, fat, so having excess body fat. People that have a lot of muscle also are going to have very high BMIs. Athletes, even athletes that we think of as being very, very lean, tend to have higher BMIs. They may be overweight or even obese by BMI simply because they have a lot of muscle mass. They don't actually have very much fat. They just have a lot of muscle. Muscle weighs more than fat. They have high bone mineral density. That's going to be the case as well. Okay. People of African descent tend to have more dense bones. Osteoporosis is one of the few health conditions where it seems like in the African American or folks of African descent, that community, they're better off there than their sort of Caucasian counterparts. One of the things that the coronavirus has kind of brought home, that I hope everybody is paying attention to, is the idea of what we call health disparities. There are people that are older, people that are in poverty, and people of lower socioeconomic status, and African Americans. If you tend to have more secondary health issues, then the coronavirus tends to affect you to a worse extent. And so that's what we would call a health disparity. So one health disparity that we don't have between African Americans and Caucasian Americans is bone mineral density. So we need different BMI things when we're wanting to compare people of different ethnicities. So actually people that are of American, Native American, and even Asian descent actually have worse bone mineral density things than Caucasians, okay? There's different relationships in old and young, in men and women, and so BMI is really not a great measure, but we have a huge amount of data on it, and so it's useful in the same way that like a battering ram or a baseball bat is useful, because it's a kind of a very blunt instrument, but it tells us something, okay? Body composition is much more nuanced, can give us a much more clear picture of what's going on with people, but it tends to be more difficult and more expensive to make those measures, and so we can't just call people on the phone or have them fill out a thing online and get these very, very large data sets that would let us be able to draw these conclusions. Oh, excuse me. Whew. Okay, so here we have our somewhat anthropomorphized gentleman. And in a very, very, very generalized sense, if you have a higher BMI, okay, you're going to tend to weigh more for what your height is, then you tend, in most people, to have excess body fat, okay? Now, as you increase your body fat percentage, as your weight goes up, you have to carry that weight around when you move, so you're actually going to gain some muscle mass because of that. But much of that's going to be counteracted by the significant increase in body mass, or in fat mass. Okay, so here we have our somewhat normal under 25 kilogram per meter squared BMI. Here is our sort of overweight 25 to 29 BMI. Our guy's a little bit fluffier. We're somewhat moving towards dad bod here. Okay, and then we have our obese guy. And the real thing is, we will talk a little bit later on, where you deposit body fat, where you store the fat in your body matters, okay? And so this, I can't, where'd my thing go? Here, this deposition of fat, which looks like a beer belly, or what we would sometimes refer to as a beer belly, tends to be much more prominent in men. And this is called android type obesity. This is called visceral adipose tissue, kind of in and around where your belly button is. Depositing fat here is more predictive of developing type 2 diabetes, of developing cardiovascular disease. This type of body fat deposition seems to be worse than, as you can see in our fellow, that he's got a little bit extra in his neck and around in his face, or if you deposit it in your butt or your thighs or your arms or someplace. So this is one of the reasons men tend to be more prone to depositing fat there compared to women. And so this is also one of the reasons why we think that men develop cardiovascular disease and in some instances diabetes at higher rates than women. It's about where the fat tends to get deposited. Okay, so for instance, or for an example that I was talking about how it makes no distinction between the composition of what you're done, here are two gentlemen that have the exact same height and the exact same weight, one of whom is a bodybuilder, the other of whom is not. Okay, so they are a person that's 5'11" who weighs 220 pounds. Our bodybuilder only has 5% body fat. Okay, his BMI is 30.7. Here we have our sedentary gentleman. He's 5'11". He also weighs 220 pounds, but he has 30% body fat. Okay, and so the BMI doesn't make any distinctions between these two. But it's reasonable for us to assume that the bodybuilder, because he has more muscle and less fat, this higher resting metabolic rate, that it's likely that he is going to be more fit and therefore less likely to die from anything than this gentleman on the right, who has a higher percent body fat, okay, even though they both have the same BMI. So as I said, BMI is in many ways a blunt instrument, but it's better than nothing, all right? Okay. To understand body composition, though, to understand what it is that you're actually made up of, we need to revisit what you guys, I'm sure, talked about in anatomy and maybe to some extent in physiology, and talk about what are the compartments of the human body, right? What are you made up of in general, okay? And kind of how is that going to be distributed throughout everything? So what you can see in our picture here is that an average man, about 45% of their body weight is going to be from muscle. Okay, in an average woman, it's about 36. Okay, men have more muscle than women. In an average man, even though we have no way of measuring this without starving you to the point of you dying, we assume that there is what's called essential fat. Okay, this is your body has to have some amount of stored lipid. Okay, and if it goes below that number, that you will very likely die. We assume in men it's about 3 or 4%. We assume in an average woman it's about 12%. Although, as I said, the only way for us to know this for sure would be to starve you until we got that fat percentage down to where you died. And so that's a completely unethical thing. We think it's about 3% in men and about 12% in women. Okay. Ladies, that 12% is mostly going to be due to the chance that you were, even when you're very, very lean, that you were to get pregnant, that the body needs and wants to have some extra energy reserves so that you have some additional energy to help maintain a fetus. Okay. So in an average guy, non-essential fat is about 12%. So an average college-age male is going to be somewhere around the about 15% body fat. Although those data are a little bit old. In the HES department, we're probably kind of right in there. If we were to get outside of HES, we were going to go over to business or, I don't know, maybe physics or something where people are a little less fit, a little less active in general. It may be a little higher. An average college-aged woman has about 15% of her body weight is about 15% non-essential fat. So you guys look at that. So an average guy is about 15% body fat, an average woman, and this is what we would think of as a relatively lean woman is about 27% body fat. Okay, so I usually make a big deal about this and say, okay, in class we're going to get a percent body fat on you, and I don't want anyone to freak out by what your numbers are, either men or women, be it high or low. We'll look at some other modalities of kind of how we measure body composition. And I should ask, we'll see it on Monday. I can ask one of my former students. She is a fitness instructor now. But we would do DEXA, what are called DEXA scans, which are these really kind of highly accurate x-rays that give us a very, very good estimate of body composition. And you would see her, she was a soccer player in college, and you would think she has no body fat. And on the DEXA, she's 21% body fat. And so it's one of those things that the numbers that people talk about and that you see like on Instagram and things, they're all wrong. They're all dramatic, these very dramatic underestimates. So men are about 15% bone, women about 12, and then each of you guys are about a quarter other stuff, organs, water, things of that nature. Okay, so that's how we're going to distribute things. When we try to quantify your body composition, okay, we use different techniques, and those techniques are going to make some assumptions of which of these things are they going to try to estimate. Okay, which of them are they going to try to estimate? How fine, how many kind of compartments are they going to try to separate you into? Okay, so the majority of the ones that are kind of readily available and inexpensive are going to be what we would call a two-compartment or a two-component model of body composition. They're going to try to separate you into muscle and then everything else, okay? Muscle and everything else. Or I apologize, I said that backwards. It's fat and then everything else, okay? In that everything else is muscle, water, bone, organs, those things. You're going to get separated into fat mass and what we call fat-free mass. Okay, my apologies for saying that backwards. Right? The more advanced ones, like the DEXA, or if you were to get an MRI done, or there's a couple of other things that we will just briefly mention, they will try to separate in the fat-free mass, they'll try to separate bone from everything else, or bone and muscle from water and those things. And they'll try to be a little bit more accurate at quantifying what that kind of fat-free mass is. And that gives us a much more accurate picture of what you're made up of. Okay, I probably should have had, all right, mild trigger warning. If you're at all squeamish about dissecting things, close your eyes on the next slide and I'll tell you guys when we can go on, okay? So we'll switch back over. So I know that many of you, if you had anatomy with us at OU, you did a cadaver dissection. The single best way to assess a person's body composition is through what we would call or term an anatomical dissection. We need to cut you open, cut out every individual piece of tissue, okay, and weigh it, and then take it and figure out what percentage of that weight is, what is it made up of? What of it is adipose tissue? What of it is lipid? What of it is mineral? What is it of everything? Okay. This, of course, is entirely infeasible. If we want to know Lindsay's body composition, obviously we cannot do an anatomical dissection on her. Okay. So all of the ways that we normally measure body composition are what we call indirect measures. Dissection is direct, okay? We can take out a tissue, we can weigh it, and then we can break it down into its individual molecules. Our indirect measures are all going to be based upon a correlation to a reference cadaver, or several reference cadavers. So some poor graduate student somewhere has done, in these labs, they've done multiple dissections on men, women, old people, young people, okay, people that are athletes, people that were sedentary. They've done these multiple dissections. So they know what a person is actually made up of. And then in a very morbid way, they have made these indirect measures on these cadavers, and then they use that information to then go back and decide we're going to make these estimation equations so that when we take skin folds or we do bioelectrical impedance on one of you, the equations, we can use the equations that they formed from these cadavers to estimate what you're made up of. Okay, that's how we've arrived at a lot of this. So one of the most common ways when we do an indirect estimate of what you are made up of, several of them rely on the principle that is called densitometry. Okay, densitometry. So densitometry is, we calculate a density by taking your mass and dividing it by your volume, okay? And if we know what your density is, we know from doing anatomical dissections that muscle has a certain density, fat has a certain density, bone has a certain density, water has a certain density. And so if we could find a way to determine the overall density of your body, then we can do some proportions and some math and estimate how much of you is fat and non-fat based upon that. Okay. So the problem then that we have is how do we measure your mass and how do we measure your volume? So I'll ask the question, we'll ask it this way. How would I measure your mass? Let me look at who all is, your mass, who all is here, who is with us. We will do it this way. Cheyenne, can you hear me? I know you were having problems with video earlier, but are you still here?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. If I
Can you
wanted to
hear
know
me?
what
Yeah.
your mass was, how would I determine that?
You'd weigh me?
Perfect. Exactly right. Okay. I would weigh you. Very good. We can all go get on a scale. We may not want to, but we can all go get on a scale and get our weight. That gets us our mass. Okay. Good. If I wanted to calculate your volume, though, Kylie, how would I calculate your volume?
Honestly, I don't really know.
Okay, good. That's a very, very common answer. Does anybody had geometry? Anybody remember geometry? Everyone's like, no, Dr. Black, we hate math. Math is the worst, right? I've not had geometry since high school. Does anybody remember if I had here, I have my snack from earlier. I have my Cheez-It box, okay? If I wanted to calculate the volume of my Cheez-It box, what would I have to multiply together to get its volume?
Length time width time height.
Very good, Ty, okay? Length by width by height, okay? Excellent. To get the volume of a cube, we do length by width by height. I don't know about you guys, but I am not a cube, right? I look at myself in the mirror. I'm not a cube. There's a nice equation for calculating the volume of a sphere, or the volume of a cone, or a cylinder, or a whole bunch of things. The problem is that we aren't any of those things. We might have a segment of our body that is, but we're not any of those things. So how would we calculate your volume? What would we need to do?
Couldn't you do water displacement?
We can indeed do water displacement, Maddie. Very good, okay? I assume, and maybe this is a reasonable assumption, I assume that most of you have at one point in your life taken a bath. Everybody try to think of the last time that you took a bath, okay? Or maybe like in the spring, I'm like, all right, it's going to be spring break. Y'all got to figure out how many people can we fit in a hot tub or something like that. So when you take a bath, you fill the tub up with water, and then you get down in the tub. What happens to the water?
The water rises.
Very good, Jordan. The water level will rise, okay? If you know how much water is in the tub without you in there, and then you get in the tub, and your volume displaces that water, the level rises, and you can measure how much water appears to be in the tub, right? In there after you've gotten in. The difference between those two is your volume, okay? It's your volume. So one of the ways that we can try to measure your body density is we weigh you and get your mass, and then we need to calculate your volume, and we can try to do that by figuring out how much water you displace, okay? We can also do some things where we can try to directly calculate your density, okay? Where we're not going to use your mass, but we're going to do a couple of other things. And so we're going to make use of something called Archimedes' principle. And we're not going to get into Archimedes' principle. It's a wonderful exercise in physics class. But Archimedes wanted to figure out if a crown was actually made out of gold or out of lead. And for all we know, this is a parable about something. But if you drop something in water and it has more density, right, then it's going to displace more water than if it doesn't, right? Or it will weigh more underwater than it will outside of the water. So one of the things that we're going to do then is, okay, wait, let me go on. We're going to do underwater weighing first. So I apologize, I'm going slightly out of order. Did not realize what my order was on these things. Is one of the ways that we can figure out what your body composition is we do something called underwater weighing, okay? And so if you take exercise testing and prescription, no, I apologize. If you take exercise physiology lab as a class, you will do underwater weighing. You will go into Dr. Larson's lab, and she has this hole in the floor in her lab that is like a giant, very, very deep bathtub. And I don't know, it's like 15 feet deep or 10 feet deep or something. We fill it up with water, and it has what looks like a swing in it, but that swing is connected to a scale. And you sit on the swing, and we lower you down into the water, and we look at the difference between what you weigh outside of the water and what you weigh inside of the water. Okay, and that can help us calculate both your volume and your density. And so if you have more fat, fat is less dense than water, so fat will float. Muscle and bone are more dense than water, and so they will sink. And so the more muscle and bone that you have, the heavier you're going to be, the more you're gonna try to sink in the water. The more fat that you have, then the more buoyant you're going to be, the more you're going to try to float, so the less you're going to weigh in the water. And we can use that through some complicated calculations to calculate what we think your percent body fat is going to be. Okay, so this is why my wife and I have been talking about taking our daughter and going and doing swimming lessons. I can remember when I was little that for whatever reason, when I would go to swimming lessons, I always wanted to be able to float. And if you look at little kids, okay, before puberty, men and women, or little boys and girls, have very, very similar body compositions, and kids oftentimes have a difficult time floating as well as adults because they have less body fat. Okay, I was always jealous. My mom could float better than me because she had more body fat than I did, and so she could float a little bit better, and I would always sink, and I wanted to float so I could just lay there. Okay, that's the idea of using underwater weighing and using densitometry. There was a time where, as exercise physiologists, using underwater weighing was the gold standard way of assessing body composition. Okay, it is no longer the most accurate way for us to do things, and it also creates some problems. Has anybody seen the movie Silence of the Lambs? If you have not, you can probably YouTube. Okay, we sort of not so affectionately refer to the underwater weighing pit in Dr. Larson's lab as the Silence of the Lambs pit. But in the movie, that guy had kidnapped someone and had them down in this hole and was holding them down there and would, lower things down to them and whatnot. There's also been some backing up of stuff out of the sewer into the underwater weighing tank, and you can't see out of it. So if you're at all skittish about having to dunk yourself underwater, you have to blow all the air out of your lungs. You have to go as forcefully as you can, then hold your breath, and then get dunked under for 30 seconds. It can be a little bit of a surreal experience. I do not love being underwater like that, and so it can be difficult to get people to volunteer. Oh dear, okay. Let me talk about another measure with densitometry, okay? And we will ask people, as I'm looking at all of this. So, Lindsay, you're still here? Yes, I can't see you anymore.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so the next one that we're going to use, this one may be right in your wheelhouse. The next one that we have is something called air displacement plethysmography. And you get in this thing in the picture here called the bod pod. And it looks like something from like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or something like these pods. But you get in there and it blows air across you. And through something called Boyle's Law, if we know what the air pressure is on one side of you, like what we're blowing on you, and then we measure the pressure of the air on the other side of you, and we know what the overall volume in the chamber without you should be, then we can calculate like your volume by the differences in air pressure. It's called Boyle's Law. So I know that over in athletics, they have a bod pod. And Lindsay, have you guys ever had to get in the bod pod?
Yeah, we do it like 2 or 3 times a year.
Okay.
And
So because the folks in athletics also have a DEXA scanner, which is probably more accurate, but they have to have a physician essentially write a prescription to order the DEXA, which is laughable in some ways. We don't have to have a physician if you want to come get a DEXA scan in one of our labs. You get more radiation flying in an airplane than you do from a DEXA scanner, but that's just kind of, they want to be overly cautious. But this is also a way that people have used. This is a machine. It is maybe a little more practical for more people than doing the underwater weighing tank. One of the things that you have to do when you get in the air displacement plethysma, when you get in the bod pod, is ideally you must shave all of the hair off your body and get in wearing like a wetsuit, or get in wearing like just a very like tight fitting like Speedo bathing suit and nothing else, and put your hair up in a shower cap, because hair and clothing and things will catch the air and change the pressure, and they will make the measurements wrong. So there's some other issues that kind of go on with all of this. We have a bod pod. And if any of you were able to do human research for your capstone experiment, we have a bod pod. If you want to measure body composition in people, we can teach you, and you have the option to come and use the bod pod on folks if you would really like to. Okay, so I'm going to back up now, okay? And if underwater weighing used to be the gold standard, okay? It used to be the best and most accurate thing that we could do. And air displacement plethysmography is about as accurate, okay, as the underwater weighing. It's a little newer kind of a thing, but it's about as accurate. What I want to tell you about now are 2 other densitometry-based measurements that are more accurate than either one of the underwater weighing and the air displacement plethysmography, okay? And those are what we would call high-resolution imaging techniques, okay? The first of those is an MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. That's the first one, all right? How many of you have had an MRI done? Anybody had an MRI? I've had more MRIs on my shoulder than I would like to think about from throwing a baseball way too much, okay? So a couple of you have had one. Do you guys remember how long you were actually in the bore of the magnet? Whitney says no. Lindsay, you said you'd had one. Do you remember how long you were in there when they did the imaging?
30 or 45 minutes.
Okay, that's pretty reasonable for most things, but you got to sit really still. Like I'm sitting here, right? And it's like, okay, don't move. Because if you move and you wiggle, then it throws off and it blurs the images and everything. So as part of my doctoral work, we did lots of MRIs to quantify muscle mass and fat mass and some other things. And we would mostly just take images of either calves or quads in people. And it would take, a single kind of deal there takes 20 minutes or something. When they do kind of diagnostic imaging of a shoulder or an elbow or a knee or something, very often it takes about twice that time, because they do a couple of different panels of imaging. But we could, if we wanted to, we could take an MRI image of your entire body, okay? We could have you lay in the magnet, lay out like my person is here, and take these individual images of you starting at your fingertips and going about every other centimeter or so, all the way down through your body, all the way down to your toes, okay? Doing that lets us kind of get these images that look like this. These are down here in the legs and the quads. This is what it looks like in your midsection. This is kind of mid-thorax here. And in those images, we can identify individual organs, we can identify individual tissues, we can identify fat, we can identify bone, we can identify muscle, we can identify heart tissue or liver tissue. And based upon anatomical dissection, we know the individual density of all of those tissues. And so in the MRI image, it gives us enough resolution that you can draw circles, or you can draw around the outlines of each tissue, and it gives you an area. It counts up the number of pixels in the image, and it will give you an area. You multiply that area by its density, and we can get a volume and a density out of all of this. MRI is the single most accurate way to quantify body composition outside of doing an anatomical dissection. Okay, this is now the most accurate way for us to do this. But I cannot emphasize strongly enough, it is also the most time consuming, the most expensive, and because of that, it is for doing whole body composition, okay? Not just doing something diagnostically or looking at what's happening in a very particular body area. For doing whole body composition, it makes absolutely no sense to do an MRI. It's completely infeasible, okay? Most MRIs charge, insurance reimbursement rate is about $2,000 an hour for magnet time. Okay, about $2,000 an hour. It would probably take, I don't know, somewhere between 12 to 15 hours of doing imaging to be able to get enough images to do the whole body. Okay, so ginormous cost. And then some poor grad student or some poor undergraduate helper in the lab has to go through every individual image and decide what every little piece of that picture is, get its area, then calculate its density. So I mean, it might take months to do all of the analysis. So it's really infeasible to do an MRI, okay? So if MRI is really accurate, but it's not feasible, what's a better alternative? What's a more feasible, if somewhat less accurate alternative? And that is something called DEXA, or DXA, which stands for dual energy X-ray absorbiometry. Okay. DEXA it's a fancy X-ray. That's really all that it is it's a fancy X-ray. Okay. What you guys see here in the bottom is, here would be our hypothetical person. We can take a DEXA scan and we get images that look like this. Okay. We get images where you can see where the skeleton is. We get this ghosting image that in some ways shows sort of the density of each of these individual tissues. The brighter it is areas where there's more fat. And then you can see in this image where it's trying to literally break things into bone. And then red is going to be muscle and water. And then the kind of orangey yellow here is going to be fat. Okay. It takes about 5 minutes to do a whole body DEXA scan, about 5 minutes. Some of you may have been in one of my student studies or one of Dr. Larson or one of Dr. Deb's studies, and you may have had a DEXA scan done, okay? Ladies, for all of you, they're very useful for you guys to get one now, because it will give you what your bone mineral density is when you're kind of at this age where it should be near its peak. So you actually have a reference to take to your doctors 20 or 25 years from now when you begin, or 25 or 30 years now when you begin to go through menopause, okay? So takes about 5 minutes to do. We get results in 30 seconds, okay? A computer does everything. It spits it out. It's much, much more feasible. It's a little bit less accurate than an MRI. MRIs are probably going to be, if well done, within 1% of an anatomical dissection. DEXA is maybe 2 to 3% error, okay? Underwater weighing, air displacement, plethysmography, maybe 4 to 5% error. Okay, so DEXA really is the most commonly used in kind of what is considered to be the new gold standard for doing body composition is DEXA. Even though MRI is more accurate, it's completely, we don't ever get to use it. Okay. All right. So let me talk about skin folds really quickly, and then we will call a halt for today. Okay. Of our indirect measures, skin fold is an interesting one. Okay. Skin fold measures are actually what we call double indirect because we're measuring one thing. So when you're doing underwater weighing, we're able to actually calculate a density. Okay, we can get a density, and then from density, we can directly measure density, and from that we can estimate body composition. Using skin fold, we're going to measure the thickness of various sort of subcutaneous fat areas on your body, and based upon measuring fat, we're going to estimate what your body density is, and then once we estimate your density, we'll use the density to estimate your body composition. So what you can hopefully take away from that is that there's more chance for error because it's a double estimation when we do skin folds. Okay. Since you guys aren't going to be doing these in lab like we would normally do, it's very, very easy when we do it in lab. It becomes very apparent how you can either over or underestimate body fat using skin folds. But the idea behind the skin fold is that the amount of overall fat that you have in your body is directly related to you storing that fat in your subcutaneous spaces. Okay, so like if I grab my flabby tricep, which maybe you guys can see, I'm pinching my flabby tricep, I'm pulling it down here. You can see my wonderful farmer's tan that I have, but I've got my flabby tricep. I would pinch this, measure its thickness, and then do that at some other places on my body, and that's going to give me a rough estimate, okay, if we think of how much total body fat you have. If you have more total body fat, then you've got more that's stored in these subcutaneous areas, which is the largest body fat store. And so therefore, you're gonna have a lower body density. Okay. On Monday, we will go through the sites that we tend to use when we assess this. Okay. And we'll also talk about bioelectrical impedance, which if you've ever stood on the machine at the front of the Huff over by the desk where they let you in, the machine that looks like what this woman is standing on, it runs electrical current that's imperceptible into you, and it uses how quickly that current moves from one foot to the other foot to estimate how much muscle and fat you have. We'll talk about kind of how that works. Okay, this is as good a place as any for us to stop for today. So I'm going to stop sharing and